If you're trying to figure out the best ways to fund your kids' or grandkids' college educations, what are the pros and cons between a 529 plan and the various alternatives? Should you use your own state's program? What happens if you're getting a really late start? If you're hoping for the best shot at financial aid, what's the best way to position your kids' or your grandkids' assets and income? What if Junior is begging to attend a super expensive school but wants to pursue a career that pays peanuts? All this and more right now on the Retirement Lifestyle Show.
Welcome to the Retirement Lifestyle Show. I'm your co-host, Roshan Loungani, here as usual with Erik, Olson, and Adrian Nicholson. We're really excited about our topic today. Thanks for joining us for another week. Adrian, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Roshan. I'm happy to be here. Happy to be here on another episode of the Retirement Lifestyle Show. We have a great topic today. It really hits home with me. And Erik, do you want to kind of lead our listeners in today's episode?
Sure. So today we're talking about college funding. And we consider this an important topic for our listening base because, first, whether you're a parent or you're a grandparent, you're an uncle or you're an aunt, you've probably at one point or another been thinking, how do I help those little kiddos? How do I help them make sure that they have the wherewithal to attend a university or college and come out on the other side ready to go for adulthood? So, which is not to say that the only strategy for preparing for adulthood is that path, but for many of our listeners, certainly that's the way that their default thinking about preparation proceeds. So what we wanted to do today was to talk about, first and foremost, the funding side of it. And this is personal for me. This last week, we had been modeling how we could specifically have a role in not just a sort of periodic, episodic contribution toward our grandchildren's 529s, but how we could make now a line item in our budget that would go on until they finally hit each of them. The last one of them hits her senior year. And if more kids come along, then how do we fund that too? And what's the level of commitment that we need to make to help both our grandkids and, for that matter, our kids succeed in this area? So it's we just thought we'd pass along some of the lessons that are out there in case, particularly for you grandparents, it's been a while and you haven't really dealt with this stuff that closely. This will give you a chance to do some basic learning, and then we'll certainly invite you, as always, to circle back and talk with us on an individual basis for a more customized approach to you. We get a lot of questions from clients about this sort of thing, and they're looking at both conventional approaches to funding it and sort of the unconventional approaches to funding it. So we want to make sure that yours is not just, you're not adopting just a cookie cutter approach to this, but it's one that's tailored to your circumstances. But anyway, since it's such a huge financial commitment now, in terms of the cost of college attendance, we thought it's not just a minor funding question. So let's get to it.
Yes, and Erik, you mentioned you're looking for the grandkids. I'm also looking for 3 kids that I need to plan for. So definitely a personal topic as well. One thing I think we'll start out with, you mentioned about just the cost, and so just to put some numbers out there. And we'll share this link, but there's an estimated annual future college cost. So I'm going to throw the number out and let both of you guess. If you have a 2-year-old, what do you anticipate in-state public school will cost them per year by the time they reach age 18 and are ready to go to college? Now we're talking in-state. Any guesses?
Adrian, you want to give that a shot?
I'm not really sure. I'll just go with 75,000.
Erik?
You're talking about per year or total for your cost?
Per year, in-state tuition.
Oh, per year, okay.
In-state tuition, well, I'm going to say it's going to be about $40,000 a year in-state tuition.
$40,000. And Adrian, you sticking with 75, or did you want to change it after I gave
I'll just keep it. What's the number, Roshan?
Right in between. It's almost 56,000. And just
I was closer. I was closer this week.
It depends. Are we playing Price is Right rules? Well, you would win with Price is Right rules, actually. So yes, and just to show you the difference, private school, you have a 2-year-old now. What's the average private institution going to cost per year by the time that 2-year-old's 18? Erik, you go first this time.
Well, I'll go first so that Adrian can pull his fast one on me and go a penny lower. But I'll say I'm going to say that the total cost on an annual basis, we're talking about gross price tag, not necessarily net, is going to be in the neighborhood of about $100,000 a year. I'll say $110,000 a year.
110. Adrian.
I'll probably go maybe a little bit lower, like around 80,000, around that level. Yeah.
Close. You should have gone the other way, though, Adrian. It's expected to be $126,000 per year, meaning a 4-year education is just a little over $500,000, which is currently higher than the average home price in the United States. So, Erik, when you talk about how expensive it is earlier and alternative paths you briefly mentioned in our introduction, we'll definitely cover that, but college tuition is expensive and it's expected to continue going in that direction. So let's talk about how to fund it. So when we're looking at college funding, I like to look at the 529 first, just because you get a tax deduction there in your state potentially. So it's worth looking into that, getting the tax deduction. Plus, if you use it for college, use that money for college, and actually with the new tax law from a couple years ago, you can use it for high school, grammar school, and so on as well, private institutions, but your growth is tax-free. So you get the tax deduction, you get some tax-free growth. Now the tax deduction is limited by state and it varies the amount, but that's where I like to start first. When you think about where's the first dollar you save towards education, that tends to be the first place I like to look at least until you've maximized those tax benefits. Gentlemen, what are your thoughts on that? Someone says, I want to save for education.
Yeah, I think the 529 is it's a great place to start, and I think an interesting element of the 529 is you can change the beneficiary who it goes to. I think that's an important element as well. If you have multiple children, if you want to just change who it is or have extra funds to it, I think it gives you the flexibility to use that. I think that's great. And the tax benefit as well is also an extremely important element. When it comes to looking at various 529 plans, you should look at the fee structures that go into them and the investment options are well. I believe those are a big part of it to consider. And also how you set up your investments within that plan is also a big part of it. Seeing how long you have till you have to fund the beneficiary's education is another big factor when it comes to setting them up.
Mm-hmm. So it's probably also worth knowing, since we are advisors, so we have we recognize that helping our clients manage this is one way in which we can operate our business as well. But I would just highlight for people that there are in most states there are at least 2 versions of a 529 plan, and so there's one that's the direct version where you don't go through an advisor, and then there's a second version which, if you wish to have your advisor involved, then you'd use that version. And of course, the difference is that in the second case, your advisor is being compensated to some extent by virtue of that arrangement. So it kind of depends on you. If you really just don't want to have any involvement in it, and you just like somebody else to set it up and do it and make the decisions, then by all means go ahead and use an advisor. But if you feel like you can use some of the built-in tools to do it directly, that's certainly an option for you.
Yeah, and actually, I should have started there explaining what the 529 is. So that's an education savings account. It's run by your state, which is why the amount you can deduct will vary by state. Also, Erik mentioned there are 2 types. I would actually take a step back, Erik, and say within the 529 is also what's called the prepaid tuition plan.
Yes, right.
So there are, using an umbrella category, I would say the 2 types are a prepaid tuition plan, where you give your money, the state calculates what they think you should pay on a monthly basis, and if you have a 2-year-old, it's starting from their age of 2 all the way through to college, and you pay that money every month. and you're prepaying the cost of tuition. If your child goes to an out-of-state institution, you get the state equivalent, so they give you the state equivalent to help fund that out-of-state institution. What you're doing here, though, is the investments are then on the state. You're not managing your investments. The other type, where Erik mentioned there were two sort of subcategories under it, it's the type where you can manage the investments. There are a bunch of investment options, and you can do one that's either with an advisor's help, and they'll help you make the decisions on the investments, which means they're also compensated for that, or there's one without an advisor attached to it where you still get the state tax deduction and so on, but you select the investments on your own. So when you're looking towards saving for education, I mentioned some of the benefits at the beginning, the fact that if you put money in a 529, you can get a state tax deduction, and that limit varies by state, and you get tax-free growth. That's only on the type of plan where you manage the investments, not the prepaid tuition type. So your state has both of these, and included in our show notes will be a lot of resources. One of them that I like when you're looking towards this is an easy one to remember is savingforcollege.com. They have a lot of good information on there, and I think I've been looking at this site for as old as 529s are, right? 20 years or so. They've done a pretty good job. So a great resource to look at for the different types of plans your state offers, the deductions, the investments. They've got a lot of good data there. Mm-hmm. Gentlemen, anything you would add on that? 529s.
Yeah, one more thing I'd add would just be contributions and income limits are pretty favorable when they come to 529 plans. Can you get a little bit more into that, Roshan? I think that'd be pretty helpful for our listeners.
Well, from a contribution perspective, where you can put in pretty much what you want. They do have various limits by state, but you only get a deduction on a certain portion. So I know, like locally in Virginia, where our offices are, you get a tax deduction of $4,000 per year per beneficiary to put it in. And then if you look at another state, just to give an example, which is also near us in D.C., you can get, in Virginia, it's $4,000 per year per beneficiary. So you could do that per child, whereas in D.C., it's $4,000 per year, but they cap you at $8,000. So what that means is in D.C., if you have 3 children you want to put money aside for and you do $4,000 each, your benefit tax deduction is capped at $8,000.
So is that a tax credit or a tax deduction?
It's a state tax deduction in Virginia and D.C. Is it different
let me clarify.
in Illinois?
What's the tax rate in Virginia?
5.75.
So to get a $4,000 tax deduction, you'd need to put in almost $80,000.
No. You put in $4,000. That $4,000 is deductible, so your net tax savings is $230.
Oh, I see. You're capped at the $4,000. Oh, I see. All right. Well, that's interesting. So in Illinois, where I had been living until just a moment ago, you could contribute. Each member of a household could contribute $10,000. So you could put in $20,000 in a year,
yeah. And
as a result, you'd have at what was effectively a 5% tax rate, 4.95. You'd save $1,000 on taxes.
Yep. Yeah. And so it is similar in the sense that they're using it is a deduction, not a credit, but different in the caps. So look into your state. As I said, that Saving for College is a good resource for it. And I'll move on to the next area. And once again,
let me just say one more thing about that, because there's another element of it. Should you use your state's own plan? And I would say if your state is a relatively high income tax state and you have a circumstance where there's a fairly high cap on how much you can contribute and have that portion deductible, then there's a strong motivation to really look at your own state. But if you're in a low tax state or a no tax state, then of course that's not an issue. Or I would say, just on the basis of what you said, I didn't know your numbers were that low. If the only real gain is on a tax deduction benefit, the effective savings on a tax side is $200. It might make sense to say, if it's not a great plan, is it worth $200 to have a costly plan just to get the tax benefit? So I would say don't hesitate to look at plans in other states, because the money is portable. Your child doesn't have to go to school in that state using the, because you use the, let's say, the Timbuktu plan, your child has to go to school in Timbuktu.
Yeah, and also it's a comparison and a mentality, I think, what you're comfortable with from an investment rate of return as well. So if you look at your state's plan and you say, well, I get a tax deduction, but I don't like the investments within them, you can look to another state and you can say, all right, well, my tax deduction would save me X amount per year in either dollars or percentage. Do I think this other plan's investment will outperform the tax savings where it might be worth foregoing? So the mentality side of it, when I look at something like this, is the guaranteed tax deduction versus the uncertain investment returns, and which you feel comfortable with, whether you think you'll win that battle if you decide to get
So it's underlying performance of the investments, underlying cost of the investments, and the tax considerations all need to be taken into account when you do this. The other thing I'll mention, though, is that although the conventional approach to the traditional investment, market-based growth 529, that's fully portable. It's not the case with prepaid tuition plans that they're portable in the same way. So let's say that I use the Illinois plan and I contribute to the prepaid tuition version of it. It's based on a calculation of what the state of Illinois has projected my child's cost of education would be on a per capita weighted basis across all the state schools. So, for example, you have University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana has one price structure, Northern Illinois University and has another, and so forth and so on. So they are just looking at how many students are at each of these schools, what is the cost for each of these schools. They weight that out over all those students, and then on that basis, that's what the prepaid tuition plan is projecting they have to cover as an average cost across all the state. But if my child elects not to go to one of those state universities, then what essentially they'll do is they'll redeem out the money on that weighted cost basis, and then I take that pool of money and I can use it elsewhere. So it's not, just to emphasize, it doesn't guarantee me that I'll get a state school education paid anyplace. It's, in that case, it's really only in my own state that I can have confidence that the prepaid approach has secured me that tuition cost.
Yeah. Yes. And you mentioned this earlier, but also, actually, I believe Adrian mentioned this. You can change the beneficiary as well. So it's worth noting that if you have multiple children, and you think, well, I want to make sure I can pay for a private school, but is the likelihood of all of them going to a private school higher or lower? And then you can just say, well, I'll put more in this one account versus this account, and you can always move it around. And use it if you decide to go back to school yourself and you want to move it to you from your children. You're welcome to do that as well. So there is that beneficiary, that flexibility of changing the beneficiary. Next, I've got on my list, if someone says, all right, I want to save for college, they've done the 529, gotten the state tax deduction, whether it's for your child or your grandchild, I like to go next to a regular investment account. And there are a lot of situations that vary, but to me it also depends on the goals you're working towards. So what I mean by this is a regular investment account is just setting up a brokerage account. If you're a grandparent and you want it to go to your grandchildren, you can just put them on the account as beneficiary, or if you've got a trust, you can put the trust as a beneficiary on the account. What it gives you that the 529 doesn't is it gives you more control. With the 529, if the money is not used for education, you can get to it, but you've got to pay taxes on the growth, plus you've got to pay a penalty. Whereas a regular investment account, you can access it if you need it for anything else besides education. So that's sort of the positive and negative. If you want to pass it on to your kids or grandkids and you want to make sure it's only used for education, the 529 is superior. On the flip side, if you want maximum flexibility and say, not only do I want my kids and grandkids to use it for anything, but I would like the ability to tap into it for something if needed, that's where an investment account gives you that flexibility. So as I said, I like looking at 529s for that tax deduction first, then looking at the investment account as the next step. Gentlemen, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Roshan, that maximum flexibility I think is really key to an investment account. Like you said, you're not sort of locked into specific educational expenses. You do have that flexibility if things come up or you need to use the funds for something else. I think that's really important. And those different investment options as well, I think is really important, where you're, again, you still have to consider the time frame on when you're going to most likely use those funds for certain expenses. But again, you do have that flexibility if needed, I think is extremely important.
So I'll mention another approach to this. If you're saying we're going to stay away from a 529 and we want flexibility and we want control, which depending on the family circumstance, that might make a ton of sense, especially if you're not certain that your child is one who has your child or grandchild has the sort of disposition to really follow through on a four-year education. I mean, there's a lot of students who, start who don't finish. And so you might want to say, you want to have money in a Roth IRA as an example. You can put money into a Roth, or for that matter, you could put, if you wish to, you could make gift money to your kids so that they could, as they have earnings, they can put it into their Roth. I'm talking about now I'm speaking now to grandparents. I wouldn't advise doing this for children, but to the grandchildren themselves or the future students themselves. But if you're a grandparent, you might want to gift money to your kids and they can put it into a Roth IRA. And then while the growth they can't use for college funding, they certainly can take the principal contributions that were made into that Roth and bring those out and use those under specified circumstances to pay the cost of tuition.
Yeah, you can use that, Erik. I'm not. I'll tell you why I'm not a fan of it, and I feel free to give me your feedback. But to me, the advantage of the Roth is the tax deferral and the tax-free nature of it. So if you're really maximizing the Roth IRA, you in theory want it to stay in there forever. You also don't have forced required minimum distributions for it. So yes, this can be an option where the way I would like potentially using it for college, if that's the way you go, is as a backup plan, right? I'm not a fan of using it as a primary vehicle for education, just because I think you're missing an opportunity for the longer deferred growth and the tax-free potential withdrawals by doing it this way. So I'm not disputing that it's something that you can do at all. You're completely right about it. I just don't like this being a primary vehicle for education savings, maybe a backup.
Okay.
Thoughts?
Well, I guess it's sort of like the competition for I've got $1, where I'm going to put it.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
And so I have if I have the option to have it grow on a completely tax-free basis, and I think that's there's a pretty compelling argument for doing that. So but if you've already maxed on a Roth, of course you can't contribute anything more to that. So
yes.
That's a limitation. I just really like avoiding taxes. So anyway,
I agree. I'm not disagreeing with that. What's interesting in this is if you're comparing the 529 versus the Roth in this specific conversation, right? Let's just say those are the only options, and there's nothing else hypothetically for education. I would, and I'm going slowly because I'm actually thinking this through as I go through it. The thing I like about the Roth, what you just said, is if you're not on track for retirement, right? And then you've got that flexibility to use it for either. But if you're on track for retirement, I like the 529 better for education, and especially if there's more than one child or person you'd want to fund for it, because you can move it around. But I'm trying to think where the first dollar would go if these are just the two to compare. And I guess maybe I'm hopeful that you're already putting money in the Roth and maxing that out. If you're not, though, as I think this through, if you're behind for retirement, I'd probably do the Roth before the 529. And I remember for years they would always say, you can get a loan for college, but you can't get a loan for retirement.
That's exactly right.
Right. So in that scenario, if you're behind for retirement, so I'm going to change what I said earlier. I guess not fully change. I'm going to add an addendum to it is how I'd put it. Yes, if you're not on track for retirement, definitely the Roth first. And if we're looking at all goals at once, maybe the Roth would come first. On the flip side, though, if we're speaking just education and the other goals are on track, then argument for the 529, I think, is a little bit stronger.
I think the point of this conversation, or a conclusion one can draw from this conversation, is there is not a one-size-fits-all answer for people.
Not
and so
at
it
all.
really is, to a certain extent, what's the nature of your particular circumstance. And if you'd like some help thinking that through, of course, reach out to us. It also depends not just on the nature of whether or not you're on track to fund your own retirement, but I think it also depends on how close you are to the child actually going off to school. Because while in an ideal world, we'd say, hey, I just had a baby, or my kids just had a baby. Let's get started on that, because there's a high likelihood that there's going to be a need for that money in the very predictable future. If for whatever reason that it came down to I had $1, I had to put food on the table before I put it into a 529, or I had $1, I had to save for retirement before I put it into 529, or this sort of thing. And let's say your children are 13, 14, 15, and now you're saying, okay, how am I going to do this? That it's a different answer. In fact, we should, at some point, not necessarily this episode, but come back and talk about all the other sorts of ways that people are saying, okay, it's too late for me to build a giant pool of wealth that will cover the costs of my child's education or grandchild's education. So what are some of my other options? And we certainly can talk about some of those other options.
Yeah, yes, I think that situation, you described it really well, in the sense that it does come down to personal situation for sure, and this is where I think the planning process is so valuable. And everyone knows we think it's valuable because that's what we do. We wouldn't be in something we didn't believe in.
Right.
But
exactly.
But let me continue on to our next savings area, because I think our debate on merits and costs are definitely worth having. The next thing you can look at, the next two, I'm going to sort of lump them together, even though they're different, because one, I don't use either of them very much anymore for a few reasons. So I think they're, to a certain degree, somewhat antiquated. But two, people do have them. Custodial accounts, which is an UGMA or UTMA account, depending on the state you're in. And then the other one is the Coverdell. I'll touch the Coverdell plan first. That used to be the education IRA. You can put money into it. It grows tax-free. The reason it's lost its popularity when the 529s came out and the tax law change are two things. In the Coverdell, the money goes in. It's currently capped at $2,000. It used to be $500 before, so the caps were low. So it was never quite enough for funding education. So the scenarios where you would use it previously was because it had the flexibility of using it for private grammar school or private high school. But now the 529 can do that as well. So to me, that plan is just not being used as much because of the limitations on the max, and because the superior flexibility it offered is now gone. Similar on the UTMA accounts, when people would use it for education, you in an UTMA or UGMA account, you pass the money to your children. It becomes their money. They can literally do whatever they want when they're of age, but it offered superior tax benefits. But the 529 tax benefits are better than the custodial account. So if you're focused on college, that account for that reason is also not as appealing as it was 20 years ago. Thoughts on either of those accounts? I feel like they're legitimate education savings vehicles, so we should mention them, but they're not as good as the others in terms of the benefits they offer now.
Yeah, I think there are some options to consider, and like you say, for the UTMA, the assets go to the minor on the account, and that's you kind of lose some of that flexibility compared to the investment account that we talked about earlier. I think that's an important element to consider, where they have more control on what they're going to use those funds for. I think is another area for our listeners to explore.
Yeah.
So I want to say we haven't really touched on the question of how who owns the asset factors into the financial aid formula and what is known as the expected family contribution, or EFC. Now, many of our clients are resource rich, and as a result, many of our clients don't have much in the way of a legitimate shot at need-based financial aid. So, but that's not always the case, and certainly sometimes when we're talking with the grandparents or the new grandparents whose own kids maybe aren't in that same financial position yet, it's useful to think through the question of how am I going to structure this in a way that's going to do the most good when it comes time to file that what's known as the FAFSA form. And with that FAFSA form, then from that is derived this expected family contribution. So I would say the UTMA or the UGMA, while they certainly have certain advantages, are one of the worst places if you're hoping for need-based financial aid to put money. And the reason is that assets that are, in terms of the things that score most against financial aid, or let's say differently, the things that score highest toward the expected family contribution, are number one, the child's own income. So roughly, the number I think is 50% of the child's income is earmarked as is earmarked that it should be contributed toward the expected family contribution, and that works down next to the child's assets that are deemed to be the child's assets, then to the parent's income, then to the parent's assets. And so you want to, as much as possible, you want to try to scale your structuring of all that in such a way that you, at least where you have a choice between where you locate assets, you want to put those assets where possible in the parents', not the children's names. On the income side, you could go one step further actually with that and have that asset belong to the grandparent. Then it doesn't show up as an asset. But if it's money coming out of a 529 plan that the grandparent owns and where the grandchild is the beneficiary, unfortunately, they recognize that loophole would be too big and everybody would just do it in the names of their grandparents. So what they've done is they've said, all right, income that comes, or pardon me, distributions that come from the 529 to fund the college are in fact deemed the child's income. And as a result, in the formula, they're scored as a 50% earmark toward that expected family contribution. So navigating this, there's a kind of choreography, a science to the choreography of all of this, where based on how far back the FAFSA looks at prior year tax returns, it's possible to structure this in a way that you have it in the you kind of have it sort of in a stealth mode, and you have assets in the grandparents' own 529 that are not released until the grandchild has reached a certain stage in their education. And then once they've reached that stage, then boom, presto, then you can start releasing funds from it, and they'll be in tax years that are too late in the game to count in the FAFSA formula for the junior or senior year. So anyway, there's an optimization science to the use of 529s that if you're wanting help with, we're not going to try to cover this all in this conversation, but if you'd like help with this, absolutely reach out to us and we can help you with choreography of that particular maneuver.
Yeah, and what you touched on is another thing where it varies by individual, which is figuring out withdrawals from these plans is as important as figuring out where to contribute, right? So you've got to think about that going forward, and that really is for the other major goal of retirement as well, right? Think about where you're saving today, but also think about how the withdrawals in the future will impact you, and that's where these different accounts and these different options are important. Gentlemen, I have the areas I wanted to cover from a savings perspective, and I'd like to talk about the cost benefit of education we went over before. And Erik, you mentioned that briefly at the introduction. Where would you like to start with this? We've been debating whether the cost of tuition has gotten so high that the benefit of certain types of education may not be worth it from a financial perspective, right? If you say that you can't quantify the value of learning, I'm not disagreeing with that. But if you quantify the income you'll get from that education, is it worth the cost? I've said this on this podcast before. My son loves art, and my niece is at a school that's good for. She's not majoring in art, but it's good for art students. And when we took her there, he saw that they focus on art, and he says to me, "I want to go to this school because I want to study art." And I said, "You know what? Instead of doing that, just take a year off and go travel the world and make art instead of studying it, because you might make more money that way." So a little bit of insight into my thoughts. But Erik, what were you thinking about with this topic?
Well, so there's I would say at least two kinds of worth that one can measure here. One is the financial return on your investment, and then the other is, of course, the non-financial human value. So, and I would say it's no big shocker that a lot of people meet their lifelong partners in college, and I would say there's the huge value there, especially if you wind up happily married. But I also would just say, if we're talking strictly about the financial returns, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are big differences in starting and lifetime earnings for different professions. I mean, that's obviously fully recognized, right? So let's say somebody's coming out with an electrical engineering or computer engineering or mechanical engineering degree. Recently, the starting salary for those professional degrees or those degrees is in the high 70s and pushing $80,000 a year, depending on the company and depending on the location and so forth. Whereas nationally, I think the median price to somebody who emerges with, let's say, or medium income, I should say, for the person who emerges with a liberal arts degree or with a preschool or child or early L educational degree is around half that. So which isn't to say that's not valuable, and which isn't to say you shouldn't follow your heart's desire. But if you're looking at the math of it and you're saying, I'm thinking about sending my child to a 4-year private college, and they haven't necessarily knocked the cover off the ball with their grades and their ACT or SAT scores. So, and we're of a relatively high income, so our expected family contribution is going to be pretty high, and they're probably not going to get much merit-based aid. So, in today's money, the school that's about 7 miles from here that my eldest daughter attended, if the full ticket for that, we're talking about room, board, tuition, fees, the whole kit and caboodle, $50,000 a year. So if you have to say, would it make sense to spend $200,000 and defer income generation for 4 years, and then ask that figure out a way to repay that if I don't have the money for it and I'm not pre-funding it, or even if I am, but is it worth that $200,000 investment to come out and have a degree where that child would earn $40,000 a year? You might say, well, of course, Erik, $40,000 a year, they'd make that back in 5 years. Yeah, that's not the right analysis. The question is how much did that $200,000 expenditure boost their income? What kind of income would they have had if they had not done that? And so maybe the difference is $10,000 a year. So now that you're talking about, it takes 20 years to recoup that cost. Maybe that's worth it. But I mean, that's the kind of analysis I think it's worth doing. What am I going to put in, and what are we going to come out
for a second there? I think the comparison you're making, tell me if I'm wrong, just to clarify, is which school. So hypothetically, in this scenario, it's you can get the same degree at an institution where you pay $25,000 a year versus an institution where you pay $50,000 a year. Is that correct? What you're comparing right now?
No, I'm comparing degree programs and the kind of majors that you pursue, and then asking, in light of that, does it make sense to make an expenditure of that kind on that degree, and whether that's at a private school, a state school, or wherever.
Well, certain positions that you'd want to pursue just require the degree, right? regardless of the. And so the way I'd look at it, and this is what I thought you were doing, why I want a clarification is, if you're getting a degree where the average starting salary is going to be $40,000, and you're comparing a school that's $50,000 a year versus a school that's $25,000 a year, maybe the expected income you're going to get would say go to the cheaper university, because you're not getting a boost in your income. You're not increasing your income significantly enough to justify doubling your cost of education at that point.
I think you could certainly ask that question too. I mean, it's the inverse of asking the question, should I double my income or cut my college cost in half? But my point is that you should think about,
you're not doubling your income. That's a key. Right.
No, what I'm saying is, if you go with the engineering degree versus the early L degree, you're going to have roughly twice the income. So just in terms of, look at the ratios of the return on that investment. How much more?
I'll tell you why I think that's flawed, because I think it's granted, I'm sure there are people that pick their degree based on expected income, but I think there are a lot of people that just want to pursue a certain degree.
Oh,
that's what they want to do, right?
Sure.
That's what you want to do for the rest of your life. So to me, your comparison of the engineering versus the early education, right? Those were the degrees you compared. To me, that doesn't necessarily work, because I don't know that someone is going to say, well, I want to study early education, but I'm going to go to engineering because because I want to make more money. I'm not saying people don't do that. I just imagine that's in the minority, because those degrees seem so different to me.
Well, so there's two forms of this argument, I would say. Number one is to say that the child, and it's partly philosophical, and it's partly a belief about the nature, human nature, and the nature of gifting and so forth. So if you think that if your viewpoint is that a child is sort of a pre-formed thing, and you need the best course of action for them is to pursue that degree or that career that's really well aligned with how their heart is tuned and they're wired, which, by the way, I believe that to a large extent. But if you think that's the only influence, then you should say, okay, it's pretty evident that this child is on track to be, in a less well compensated profession. Then my counsel to you would be, do the math and ask yourself if it really makes sense to send them to that $50,000 a year school to do that. So, but if you have a second view of this is that, you know what, there's a lot of joy and a lot of fulfillment in life that's derived in a variety of ways. Many of those are relational, not necessarily purely professional, and some of them are financial, in not having to struggle financially because you encumbered yourself with a large bill, either in the form of a student loan or whatever the case might be, for something that doesn't have a very high return on that expenditure. And you may find that what you forfeited in the way of happiness in some of those ways offsets enough of the supposed sort of psychological and spiritual returns, doing exactly what you love. And you might say, hey, my child is 5. And my child loves his or her teacher, and so has decided at 5 that my child wants to be a teacher. You know what? There's going to be more that your child's going to be exposed to over life. Use those years to give a broader exposure. Maybe they'll wind up liking engineering, and they just haven't envisioned what that looks like yet.
5's a different thing.
I didn't go into engineering, by the way. I'm not saying everybody has to go into engineering, but
here's my argument, Eric. I'm using you as an example, right? You are a very analytical person, right? When you were selecting your major in school and so on, you being an analytical person, you're 18 now, not when you're 5. I don't think I could have convinced you to study art and pursue art for the rest of your life if art paid $60,000 a year and any analytical focus you had paid 30. I don't think you as a person would have shifted to that degree, just because I don't, and I'm not arguing nature versus nurture. Maybe you were born that way, maybe your parents raised you that way. What I'm saying is, Eric, if you were 18 and you could double your expected annual income, and you're an analytical person, by becoming an artist, do you think you would have shifted your life's trajectory, been an art major, and done art for the rest of your life?
Well, if you knew how tremendous a fool I was at age 18 and how what's on senseless bases I used for deciding things, you'd know my answer to that would be absolutely. So
you would have I could have actually convinced you to shift.
No. I'm being completely facetious. No, I was like total idealist at that time. It was lingering after effects. I'm a recovering idealist, but okay. Yeah, so I made a lot of decisions at that point that had nothing to do with the financial ramifications of those decisions whatsoever. Having said that, I would say part of it, I think, is, how do I put this? There are certain, without, how do I say this? This is a little bit awkward. I'm going to put it this way: some cultures look at their kids and say, "Are you kidding? Your only choice is engineering, science, maybe math, although that's slumming it a little bit in this sort of thing. You're going to be a doctor. You're going to be an attorney." They basically have told the child, these are your options. They're very predetermined. You don't have any choice in the matter. Whether you like it or not, this is what you're going to do. And then you have other and the children go, okay. And they manage to find a way to have happiness within that, even if maybe law or medicine or what have you wasn't their favorite thing. And then there are other settings in which it's just like, hey, whatever you want to do, we just want you to follow your passions and follow your heart. And what you see is a lot of the kids in those kinds of settings wind up in low compensated things, and then then people are going, well, why do we have these big income disparities in this country? Well, it's partly because of the choices that people make about what they're going to pursue. So I would say on that basis, I wouldn't look at a 5 or a 7 or a 12-year-old as necessarily so preformed that you the parent just have to say, well, whatever you want, child, just let's go that way. And irrespective, I'll fund you, because here's the final, I guess, the consequence that I see on the other side of it. I see some parents who essentially felt so, what would I say, obligated to provide their children with this carte blanche experience for anything they wanted to do, that they were willing to essentially forego funding their own education, or their own retirements, I mean to say.
Yeah.
And would rack up massive indebtedness because they were so guilt-ridden about not offering their children specifically what their children wanted, and as a result now are in a kind of constant state of financial stress about this. I have other friends, not clients, but friends who had a very idealistic approach to all of this, went and got degrees in really low compensated fields at really expensive schools, and did that not just for 4 years of college, but for 2 or 3 years of graduate school, and now have these massive balances that they can never pay off, and are wondering, do I default on my loans? Do I declare bankruptcy? And I think, that we can get into that, but I would say, is that really the path that you want to follow now, because you made those choices? So it's, we can have that conversation after the fact, but it may be a better place to have that is before the fact, and not be indifferent to that kind of financial consequence and strain stemming from those decisions unexamined.
Yeah, I think this goes back to what we've talked about throughout the episode of you've got to plan these things out, right? Mm-hmm. You've got to think it through and plan it out. And with your the scenarios with the clients or the friends where they either wanted to give them anything, I always think of it, and I haven't had to live through that, right? So views do change, but at this point, I think, well, just be willing to live with the consequences. If you want to be, if you want to pursue something that will be a low-paying field, go for it. You're good. That's the life. To be prepared to live in that lower-paying lifestyle as well. So it's not that it's all about money, but I mean, we are 3 finance guys, so you'll get some of the information here. Gentlemen, any last thoughts on the education savings planning value topic we covered today?
Well, I guess I should probably just issue a corrective. I mean, just a little bit of a corrective. I want to say I am not against people pursuing their passions. I'm not against that. I'm saying prepare for that.
Yes.
So that the financial consequence of doing that isn't one you regret for the rest of your life. So saving in advance is an approach that can help you do that. I'll say one thing that we really should, at some point, again, not time in this episode, but talk about what steps can children, and for that matter, parents, take from early stages of their children's lives to set them up so that they'll get lots of merit-based aid. And that's a huge part of it. And or if they're not in a position to get merit-based aid, there are other strategies. I mean, I have some of my friends have their children have, and this is not, they didn't just do this for sort of mercenary reasons. They felt like this was aligned with their values, but their kids went and joined the National Guard in their state. And as a result of being part of the National Guard, then they got their education funded. I've had other friends whose kids, they didn't have a lot of means, but their kids were, working as caddies at the local country club and wound up getting a full ride from an Evans scholarship and things of this kind. So, thinking through how you're going to fund this is part of the entire, or how you might circumvent having to fund it is part of the whole thing. And in that point, if whether it's through some of these other means or saving for it, if you can fund something that's a low compensated professional experience thereafter, but it's your joy, more power to you. I'm certainly not saying, hey, everybody has to have one of the highest paying jobs, because that doesn't work either. So I just needed to clarify that, because I think one could be left with the impression that I'm saying everybody go be a doctor or an engineer, and I'm not.
Yeah. I think I didn't interpret it that way, but clarification is always useful. I think the way I looked at what you were saying was just plan it out, right? And then use once you've planned this out, use the conclusion you've come up with to help you make the right decision in major, in college, the type of school or no school, right? You had mentioned that earlier. Just figure out what's right for you. Adrian, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I really enjoyed the discussion. Again, it comes down to boiling down to the individual. I think that we saw that, and it's really hard to quantify like your dollars put in learning, going to an institution, and the value derived from that. It makes it seem like you got to use all the resources at hand, or there's some people that might not take advantage of all the resources or their classes or the people they go to classes with. I think is an important element of it, but it just shows how it really boils down to the individual and how planning is an important aspect of it.
I completely agree. Thank you for listening. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Retirement Lifestyle Show. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and hope you still like Erik after what he said earlier.
It's easy not to do, I'll tell you.
Please like, subscribe, tell your friends and family about us, and we'll be back to you next week with another episode of the Retirement Lifestyle Show.